Okay. All right. Well, greetings, everyone. I'm Catherine Fleming Bruce. I want to thank you all for coming today and being part of this conversation that we're getting ready to have about a bit of news that we have been waiting for about the Supreme Court decision for Alexander versus South Carolina NAACP for some time. And some of us have been working on this for some time. Others came on board, as I did, when a number of advocacy groups found out that the case was going to be before the Supreme Court in October. And so, we participated in events around that, including conversations with organizations that had provided some amicus briefs to the court for review. So we had a chance to dialogue with some of those authors, and I wanted to have a chance to talk with them again once the decision is made. So we've been waiting with bated breath for several months to find out what the court's decision was going to be, and today we have that answer. So we have three guests here with us today who had a role in several of the amicus briefs that have been presented. One is Lynn Teague with the League of Women Voters for South Carolina. One is Marion Hemingway. She is with Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce in the Low Country. She was with one of the amicus briefs and also one of the people who rode with us to DC to make our voices heard in front of the Supreme Court. Then we have Louis Venters, who is a independent scholar and historian, but also one of the faculty members of Francis Marion in Florence, South Carolina. So I wanted to hear a little bit from each of you about kind of your timeline for involvement in this case and what you think of where we are today. So Lynn, why don't we start with you?
Okay, glad to start off. I started working on this in 2016 when we actually were not wildly optimistic, but optimistic enough to put considerable effort into trying to get an independent commission to at least provide an advisory map in South Carolina, allowing the General Assembly then to vote. So we worked on that for several years with a stunning lack of success. We never even got a subcommittee hearing. We moved on to testifying in all of the hearings once the census data came out. We had a very experienced map drawer ourselves, in fact, the most experienced redistrictor of South Carolina, John Roof. We had accomplished mathematicians whose specialty includes math, advanced math and public policy, doing things like Monte Carlo Markov's chain analysis of maps of our own and of those presented by others, including the General Assembly. And then we eventually ended up, I testified in the federal case in Charleston that was decided in our favor, in favor of the NAACP LDF. And but then also worked very intensively on our amicus brief, which the Gullah Geechee also participated in. Thank you very much to Marilyn and her folks, because a lot of it was about that. It was precisely that we had over 350 years of community being torn apart by a map with no respect for communities of interest, for economic groupings, for political units. And the stats, and again, we had some very good people working on this, we're clearly not in favor of these maps being the congressional map in particular, but also the House map, the South Carolina House map, also perfectly dreadful. Senate map, nothing to write home to mom about, but not quite as bad as the others. Anyway, so the League of Women Voters has been very, very committed to working on this, and it's very disappointing to see what has happened. The National League has taken, of course, a great interest in this and has described this decision as heinous in denying Black voters and voters of color the ability to seek justice against racial discrimination in redistricting. We feel the case was made very solidly that what we were seeing was, in fact, unquestionably racial. On the other hand, we have a court, John Roberts has been known to, in official documents, refer to statistics as gobbledygook. So I'm not sure we had the most understanding audience. Anyway, so I've been very involved now for 8 years. And the league, of course, it's a big issue for the league because we care about, fundamentally, if we're going to vote, it should have meaning. It should not have been drained of meaning.
Well, Marilyn, since you were one of the groups that were working in partnership with League, with Lynn Teague on this, why don't you jump in and tell us a little bit about why you all were involved in that case and what you'd hope to get out of it and what you think of the decision today.
Well, let's start with what I think of the decision today. I think it was a horrendous decision legally, politically, and morally. And let me add this, economically also. As the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce, for us, when you don't have a voice in the political process, that is an economic question, right? That's an economic issue. And it really is a slap in the face to the Gullah Geechee community culture and others who may be marginalized in South Carolina, in particular in the 1st Congressional District. That it's very much a slap in the face. So not satisfied with today's decision, the announcement of the decision, and we will continue to do what needs to be done to bring justice to our political system, if you will. We are relatively new to this particular case. The chamber I started it in 2018, I believe. So we're newbies, but the cause that's at the heart of who we are. I am actually a civil rights baby. What do I mean by that? I was born in 1965. So that civil rights and the voting rights laws that were passed, my generation is the first generation to actually have the right to know that when we turned 18, that we could go and register to vote without counting bubbles in soap and all those other nasty things that our parents and other generations lived with. And I have been very conscious of that for most of my life. And it's something in this day and time in the United States is under attack. And it makes you realize how precious it is to have the right to vote. Right. And to see the shenanigans going on, blatantly going on, and know that our state legislature, those who've drawn this map, knew what they were doing. This is not by accident. It's very intentional and deliberate to disenfranchise those who have been traditionally disenfranchised. I just never thought in my lifetime that we would be where we are right now. And now to have the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, to not listen to the 3 judges who I believe did the right thing, and just ignore precedent, ignore the history of this country, the history of the 1st Congressional District, where has a descendant of our ancestors who were kidnapped and brought here without any rights, without any pay for their labor, very foundational to this country, that we continue to fight this again and again and again. But fight we will, because that is also our inheritance, right?
Yes.
The fight.
Yes.
But no, not happy with today's decision at all. And still kind of grasping the details, the legalese. I'm not a lawyer. So I'm still really trying to understand the implications of it, and we will see that will roll out. But we will continue to fight for our right to vote and our right to be human beings in these United States, and to partake of, the role that we have as citizens, the full citizenship that is due us, because we were born here and built this country.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I see that we have two historians, and Dan Carter has joined us. I'd really like to hear, because a lot of what Marilyn had to say came from a historical perspective. So it's an ideal segue into the insights and comments that you might have. So I open the floor to you, Dan, to just let us know what your thoughts are on this decision today.
Let's let Lewis go first. He's the real South Carolinian. I'm exiled here in North Carolina now. So although I follow state politics very closely, and in my home state, I have to keep up with two Carolinas now, living here in North Carolina.
Absolutely. Okay, Lewis, we're ready.
That's very kind. By the way, it's Louis. But just to be clear, no, that's fine. Just that I'm here in Florence County, and be assured, Dan T, that we claim you forever and ever. So you might travel far away, but you can never get away. So just to be clear about that, we're both born here in Florence County. I mean, I don't know what I can add, especially to what Marilyn just said in terms of the moral content of the decision. So the question was, how did you get involved, and what do you think of the decision? So I guess I'll just say how I got involved. I mean, it's pretty simple. Lynn started and said she'd been involved for 8 years. For me, it's more like 8 months. So I don't feel like I have a whole lot to say about that. About making this happen. I was approached by a New York law firm that I had never heard of, that sent me an email last fall and said that a distinguished South Carolina historian, Vernon Burton, has recommended that you take a look at this, and would you please consider signing this amicus brief, and could you do it by tomorrow? So I think I was the last person to sign, but thank God for that opportunity. What an amazing document that I can't claim because I didn't have any hand in writing it, but the amicus brief that the historians prepared is really a fantastic primer of South Carolina's post-Reconstruction racial, partisan, political history. And the basic thesis of it is that, since the Civil War, whichever party is the biracial coalition in South Carolina, the other party will do everything in its power, legal and extra legal, to kick the biracial party out of power and to keep it out of power by whatever means necessary. Mm-hmm. And so, in the 19th century, that's the Democratic Party that's in power. In the late 19th century, right after the fall of Reconstruction, the Democratic Party ousts this biracial coalition in the Republican Party in Reconstruction through some legal and mostly just heinous extra legal means called redemption, ironically. And then, Democratic Party keeps power through the Jim Crow order in the late 19th and through the 20th century, when the National Democratic Party begins to refashion itself as a multiracial coalition, starting with the New Deal. Black South Carolinians are pretty wise to that. And as they push to get into the political system, they want to do so primarily as Democrats, because that's the only party in South Carolina that means anything. And that unleashes, of course, an exodus of conservative whites from the Democratic Party. And so now so this is, these parties sort of, they change positions, right? But the tactics are the same. Whichever party is the biracial coalition, the other party will do anything under the sun to get it out of power and keep it out of power. That's the point that the historians were making. And so the idea is, you can say today in the 2020s, this gerrymandering doesn't have anything to do with race, it has to do with party. But that is nothing but a manipulation of language and a distortion of history. And everybody and their grandma knows it. There is nobody in South Carolina that is confused about the fact that, and I say this everywhere I go, that I myself am a nonpartisan. That's a religious belief and practice of mine that is a subject of a different discussion. But I teach race and I teach politics, right? And I'm not stupid. I am not a sheep. Okay. So you have to be pretty dense to not be able to tell that one political party is a biracial coalition and the other one is not. And the one that is not is employing language and techniques that are old and tired and not confusing in order to keep the biracial political coalition out. Okay. The difference is that, and this is how I explain it to my students, is that up until 2013, from 1965 until the year that Marilyn was born, and I was born just not too long after that, thank God, and able to benefit as a white South Carolinian in so many ways from the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Thank God. But until 2013, the Voting Rights Act assumed that the state government of these states that had well-documented long histories of voter suppression, the Voting Rights Act assumes that the state is gonna discriminate. And so the burden of proof when these states that are covered want to change their voting laws and procedures, the burden of proof is on the state to prove that this change or that change is not going to discriminate against Black voters. In 2013, the US Supreme Court took that part out of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and threw it in the trash can, right? And said now the burden is on anybody that claims they've been discriminated against. You have to prove, right? I've only started, I'm sorry I'm talking so long. I only started to read the decision, but where it starts out is it says, we assume that the state is acting in good faith. And again, historians and anybody with a pulse in South Carolina knows that can't be where you start in this discussion. The Voting Rights Act assumed that the state was going to keep discriminating and put the burden of proof on the state. The same Supreme Court under the same Chief Justice took that burden off of the state and put it on individuals, right? And here we are.
It's actually a good point that talking about the shifting of the burden of proof is important. Dan, I'm going to let you jump in here and make some comments.
Two things. One, I did get a chance to at least read through the decision, not as much as I would like, but even quickly reading through it, there were just so many things that jumped out at me as I read it. And Louis pointed out one of the main ones is this reversal of the notion of that the burden of proof is now no longer on the state with its long history of discrimination. Now it has to, the plaintiffs in the case now have to establish that they're right and the state is wrong. And that is a dramatic shift. It makes it, I won't say impossible, but given the composition of this court, it makes it very difficult to ever establish, because they deliberately set it up to say that since the majority of African Americans vote for the Democratic Party, we can't decide which part of it is simply because of race and which part of it is because of partisanship. And because the court threw up its hands wrongly, I think, years back, and said, we can't do anything about gerrymandering. We're stuck with this situation right now. I wish I could say I was surprised. I kept waiting, Catherine, to get your email saying the decision had been decided, and always with a kind of sinking feeling.
Yeah.
I think the reality is we know what the 6-member majority of this court, their attitudes about the rights of Black citizens, people of color in this country are. It's a little bit like, I don't know whether some of you are not old enough to have seen Casablanca, but there is that, of course, oft-repeated scene when Captain Renault, who played Claude Rains, I guess, is speaking to Humphrey Bogart, and he says, I am shocked to discover there's gambling upstairs, at which point the croupier hands him all his winnings. The guy who's saying that he's shocked to hear about that. Well, I am shocked to hear that this 6-member majority has no regard, really, and no, it's difficult to judge people's motivations, but it's difficult to see how either they know or care about what the reality is for Black citizens in this country. There's a kind of blindness, and not only in this case, but in other cases as well. And the last thing I would say is to simply reinforce what Louis said. I am not a South Carolina or wasn't until 2001, when of all things I was asked by the Bush administration to work on a case, Charleston County versus U.S. It began in the Clinton administration, but to my surprise, the Bush administration continued it. And I spent 2 years working pretty steadily on that, on the background, in this case, specifically about Charleston County, but more generally about race in South Carolina. And the reality, and we won. Supreme Court ruled that the system that had been set up in Charleston, they had switched from a ward system to an at-large, was because they wanted to diminish the strength of Black voting. Well, the evidence that we proved is not as strong as the evidence in this case. No one's going to find a smoking gun in which a white politician is going to say, I don't want those Black people to vote, and so therefore we're going to draw up those lines. Of course they're not. And yet that is what the court is asking for. They're asking for you to find convincing proof that the members of the legislature would do this simply because of race. And as I said, I think it sets up an almost impossible burden. But that means that the battle goes on outside as well as you keep on in the courtroom, but you've got to take the battle outside and into the political arena. That's the only way we're ever going to be able to turn this back. I keep thinking about that awful last line in Willie Rose's book on the Port Royal experiment. Revolutions can go backwards. And our job is to see that the revolution doesn't go backwards. That's what we all have to do.
I'd like to throw in that there's one particular backwardness about this, which is there actually is an extremely strong case made statistically. Yeah, but the justice, I mean, John Roberts in the past has written in an opinion describing statistics as, quote, gobbledygook. Mm-hmm. They're unwilling, there is a strong case. There is compelling evidence that race rather than partisanship defined where they drew those lines. But the class of evidence that is there, while it's accepted for everything from how to determine a proper cancer treatment to sending a rocket into space, is not accepted by our Supreme Court.
Now,
Maybe.
Carmen, I want to give Dr. Carmen Harris a chance. She's been able to join us. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I was looking for the link from you. And I missed the link. I was like, I think Catherine was supposed to send me a link. I think I want to take this less from the historical perspective than from the personal perspective as a Black South Carolinian. You know, I grew up with people in my family who had become so accustomed to not voting that even after the Voting Rights Act happened, they didn't vote. One of the things that I pride myself on as a Black intellect is not really kind of falling for some of the kind of community tropes. And there have been Black people in the community, just lay people, saying since the 1980s that the votes were going to go away and things like that. And I just poo-pooed that, you know, and just listening to Dan say that revolutions can go backward. And I mean, we had that example, right, in 1895, when they figured out every way for you not to vote that wasn't because of race. It was because you couldn't read or you couldn't pay a poll tax. And that's the same kind of exercises we see going on in this case. And I just kind of get really confused in looking at what happened in Alabama as opposed to what happened in Louisiana, and then what happened in South Carolina. You know, it just really does not make a lot of sense to me. I'm thinking I need to either go get one of these pine tree flags or fly an American flag upside down outside my house. So, you know, that's where I'm at with this right now. But I think, you know, it's something that's very important. We can try to solve it politically, but in a case like South Carolina, where not only the federal offices have been gerrymandered, the state offices are so gerrymandered that we can't approach a Democratic majority in the state house. How are you going to get to that point? I mean, I'm actually gerrymandered. I live in Greenville County. I used to live about 5 miles from where I am now. I was in William Timmons district. I moved here. I'm now, and it's just like it feels like a hairpin. I'm now in whatever, is it Jeff Duncan's district? But I always get calls on the phone from William Timmons district. He doesn't even know I've been gerrymandered out of District 4 into District 3. So I think one of the things that I you know, that comes to me personally, not as an academic, but a lot of discouragement. I feel like it's a lot of things, you know, because you have these moments in your life where, you know, I've experienced discrimination, even as someone with a PhD, and then I'll have someone question the authenticity of my feelings, or you don't really believe that was racist, do you? So I feel kind of like the Supreme Court is gaslighting me by saying that we live in a society that's, you know, it's like the majority opinion in Plessy, that, you know, if there's this issue with colorblindness, it's all in my mind. It's not anything wrong with the law. It's something wrong with me. And it's something that kind of makes you want to check out of politics, because you have these people, I mean, even though they're in the majority and they have all of the power, well, it seems like most of the power, it seems like they want all of the power. And, you know, if we look at this state, for the most part, at the state level, and you know, we get Clyburn because they draw as many Black people into his district as possible. I think if they could, they'd probably draw something around my house too to put me in there and say, you got representation. And I mean, I appreciate Congressman Clyburn, because when my father was dying of cancer and I called my own white congressman, nothing got done. And I called Jim Clyburn, who wasn't my father's congressman, but he was Black, and my dad was dying of cancer. And Jim Clyburn helped my dad get his Social Security started before he died. So that's what I have to say.
My goodness. Now I want to share with you all, because I'm here in North Carolina at a redistricting conference, as it so happens. And we've had a number of speakers to talk about what's happening in the different states in the face of the changes that are happening. One of the points made by a speaker, and I want to get your response to this, is that the courts won't save us. This is what they had to say. The courts won't save us. We have to strategize in other ways. But what do you think of that statement in terms of what we deserve and what we should have from our court system?
I agree that I think the civil rights movement, Plessy versus Ferguson, I think we're going through that type of time period again, but on steroids, because they've moved the goalposts. It's kind of like, okay, it didn't last after Plessy versus Ferguson, right? But we've learned that lesson of why it didn't last. So the lesson they're applying now in even before 2024. They started with is it Shelby, right? Is that the one, Shelby?
Right.
Then Roe is part of that, and people don't realize that. They first had to weaken voting rights to get to Roe, and now they're just finishing the job. And it is about power. I do agree with Dr. Harris about that. It is about greed and power, and that was from the beginning of this country. Was we otherized this group of people and built our economic system on this. We built our political system on dehumanizing this group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that group of people has always held us accountable to what we wrote down in that Constitution. So every few decades, we go through this rotation that changes our laws, right? And by and large, because of the U.S. Constitution, we've been able to rely on the courts to do the right thing. They've also been learning those lessons every time those changes have happened. And I think right now, the lesson they've learned from the civil rights movement after Plessy versus Ferguson, we're going back to the original intent of otherizing this group of people so that we can retain power, control, and gain more wealth. That's what we're going through right now. And I do have the question to make this personal is, now that we've moved that goalpost, or the goalpost has been moved by SCOTUS, where do we go? Where do we truly go? Because part of their effort is not only are we going to remove your voting rights, we're going to make it so difficult that you're going to become apathetic, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to want to vote. Mm-hmm. And if no other time, we need to vote. We need to put people in place to change gerrymandering or get rid of it totally, to truly represent the people. Now is the time. But part of this is not only to end voting rights, but those who do have voting rights, it's just to make it just so hard, so troublesome to vote that you just simply won't vote. And now is the time to actually vote. And right. Can we count on the courts? Clearly not the makeup of this current SCOTUS. Can we count? No, we can't count on the current SCOTUS to do what's right.
But we have something else. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, I'd like to throw it. There is one thing that voters can do, and I agree, it has become, especially for anybody who can't vote in person, it has become more difficult intentionally. But the one thing that we can do when we're gerrymandered that we don't do enough is realize what situation we're in and respond appropriately by voting in every election. Mm-hmm. Voting in the primaries. If we skip the primaries, we are skipping the real elections in South Carolina. Our figures on the South Carolina House of Representatives, very gerrymandered. Statistically, if there were an Olympic gold medal for gerrymandering, the South Carolina House would be highly competitive. But That's the only thing that's competitive. Of 124 districts, only about 10 can, even by a very generous measure, be considered competitive in November.
Mm,
People are deciding who is going to govern us in June, not in November. And
right.
most voters don't understand that. We routinely see turnout under 20% of registered voters showing up for the primaries. And as long as that continues, the situation is going to be that much worse, because people at the State House, and I'm there all the time as a registered lobbyist for the league, I've been there for 13 years, they're governing to please the people who vote in the primaries and who keep them in office.
Yeah.
We need to be those people who vote in the primaries.
And then they wanted to change it to partisan voting, which would have taken us back to the 1940s, where the Democratic primary was a general election with that fall off that you talk about. I mean, we
Right.
still have that de facto, but I think just putting it in where you couldn't go and vote in a Republican primary if there was no Democrat, if that was your voting preference, or there was no Democrat, if there was no Republican and Republican was your preference, putting those things in place are very suppressive. You know, especially if they added on to that other piece of you have to declare a party.
Right. And I also noticed there are about 40 races that are totally uncontested, you know, so of that 120 some odd seats, 40 have no competition at all. Many of the other seats where there is competition are primary competition. You know, people are primary folks in their own party. So not, and especially when you look at the supermajority that is held now by the Republicans. So somebody was saying to me that they had a desire to see more people come out so that, you know, they could switch the supermajority. I said, well, we have gerrymandering, and then we have all these seats where nobody is opposing. And so those are the formulas that have to change. But we also have to continue to work as Black Voters Matter is, as League of Women Voters is, as so many other groups are doing, working to make sure that people know more about voting, know the procedure, know the latest laws and rules, and are able to participate.
If I can speak quickly from the historical perspective, because I teach South Carolina history, I'm actually teaching it online now. I would say what you see in South Carolina is a continuity in our history going back to the colonial period. Anti-democracy is part of the foundational culture of Carolina colony. There was a point in time where you had to have a certain level of wealth to serve in particular offices. South Carolina was one of those states where you didn't, they didn't have an election for the Senate or for the governor. The General Assembly was the one that was picking those folks. South Carolina in 1860 gave electoral votes to Abraham Lincoln. So, you know, I'm wondering how many states, and South Carolina could be one of those this time around in 2024 that decides we don't need to have an election, that the General Assembly will just decide how our electoral votes are going to go. So this is something that's part of the DNA of this state in disfranchising the masses. There's never been a trust of the masses. When we look back before the 1920s, in the period after the Civil War, the masses were all majority Black. But even though we're not majority Black, I think the fact that Black people could still hold that balance of power is something that infuses the way our politics operates.
Absolutely. Dan?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know you're proud of your gold standard in South Carolina for racial discrimination. There, some people are. We were on a close second in North Carolina. As you know, it's the purple state. And in fact, in the last 4 elections, if you calculate, I didn't do it, but a political scientist did, if you calculate all the votes that were cast for the state representatives and the state senators in the North Carolina Assembly, Democrats got 55%. What percentage of representatives do you think they have in the legislature? It's 34%, 35%. It is the most gerrymandered state in the country. And it's been done, it's not just the race issue, I think, drives it, but it is exactly as Dr. Harris said, it is also a very politically driven. I'll give you just one example, and I say politically driven, economically driven. North Carolina Supreme Court is written into the Constitution of North Carolina that every vote shall be equal. And the North Carolina Supreme Court decided 3 years ago that meant you had to stop gerrymandering because the votes were not equal. Well, in the 2022 race, you may all know this, Art Pope and the John Locke Foundation and several other foundations spent millions of dollars to defeat 2 of those justices, 2 longtime justices. And they were defeated, and the new court immediately reversed that. But if that's one of the few times I think it does make a difference as far as the courts go, because if we had been able to hold that Supreme Court elected, then we may have had a different North Carolina. The other thing I would say is, if any of you ever get a chance, you'd want to find out about North Carolina, maybe backwards on it, the way it comes up here, but Indecent Assembly by Gene Nickel documents the way in which it's not only racially discriminatory, but it's also economically discriminates, and the kind of ruthlessness with which the General Assembly, under the control of this group, pushes through legislation that hurts people of both colors, but particularly African Americans. And they do it knowing they have the power, even though they don't have the votes. And that's basically what it boils down to. But we've got to, that's why the politics is so important. It's discouraging. I mean, we formed a group here called Partners for Democracy. And we're trying to get Republicans, independents, and Democrats to join in kicking out a mega school board and a mega county commissioners that are doing awful things. And I personally contacted 19 Republicans that I thought were moderate. They seemed to be sensible. They would join us. 1. We live in an incredibly tribalized politics right now, which makes it all the more important that, yeah, we have to wait till this, I don't know what it is, kind of hysteria passes. I hope it will. But in the meantime, we've got to organize every voter we possibly can, to get out the vote, because we're swimming upstream. And it's like, what they say about Ginger Rogers? She could do everything Fred Astaire did, and did it on high heels and backwards. We're in that sort of position. We're on high heels and dancing backwards, but that means we have to be able to do it. I don't know any other way around it.
Well, I want to bring up a comment by Dr. Vernon Burton, who, we had hoped he would be able to squeeze us in. He's kind of on the road, but he said he wanted to make sure to quote him saying, "It is outrageous," talking about the decision, "and at least 3 times now, the Supreme Court has disregarded 3 federal judge rulings and evidence." So wanted to get any response to that.
And I just say, because that was one of the things I'm talked too much. I'm like Louis here. Louis didn't talk too much, but in reading that decision, one of the things in Kagan's jumped out at me, and I'm no constitutional lawyer, but I taught constitutional history at Emory.
Mhm.
And there is a general, it is a general rule of the courts that particular higher courts, and particularly the Supreme Courts, gives deference to the fact finding of lower courts. And when you get in this case, a unanimous court ruling in which these people had spent months examining the issue, and then you turn around and you dismiss it as though it's important. To me, it is the flag flying upside down. It's judges who have a preordained path. They have a preordained destination in their decisions. And I mean, I hate to say that. I hate to say that we have, and I won't say a economically corrupt, but a politically corrupt Supreme Court, one in which is driven by ideology, and a very conservative ideology, which really doesn't reflect the American people. It reflects a minority, I think, of Americans.
Well, I want to thank you all once again for taking the time out of the blue to join me. I want to thank Black Voters Matter, one of the sponsors for this program. It makes it possible for us to have this dialogue. So thank you to Black Voters Matter Fund. I want to give you all this opportunity to close with any comment that you have that will give the people some hope and inspiration for what you think the next steps might be.
I've done mine, so let's hear.
Okay. Okay.
I was fortunate to be raised by a mother and father who really believed in education. In particular, my mother, after finishing my bachelor's degree, told me to continue to get your education. I think the thing that's going to get us out of this time period that we find ourselves in is education.
Mm-hmm.
On all levels. And so when my mother told me that, it wasn't just going to get a master's or a PhD. She literally told me, take community classes, workshops, anything that continues their education.
Right.
I am currently, Dan touched on it, so I'm going to touch on it, bring this into it. I'm currently working on getting my economic development certification. It is workshops, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And the last time we met at the beginning of this month, the Municipal Association came and shared an hour and a half of us teaching us about government, the different governments in South Carolina, how government works.
Mm-hmm.
One point that the gentleman made is he really wanted people who decided to run for office to come to the Municipal Association and learn how to be an elected official.
Mm.
It is optional training for elected officials in South Carolina. It is not mandatory. Once, either before or once you become an elected official in South Carolina, it is not mandatory that you get trained on how to be an elected official. What that has allowed to happen is that outside groups who may have a certain ideological bent
Mm-hmm.
come and bring laws to our elected officials.
Right.
With promises of money, et cetera, et cetera. Until we understand the impact of that, until we get educated ourselves, because I would not have, I've heard about this, I knew it intellectually, but to have someone who's in the know to sit there and say, this is not good, right?
Right.
To say training is optional for elected officials, it gave me further understanding of the impact on the local level. But it is not just local. This is all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Right.
The Supreme Court folks get appointed by people who have been influenced by outside groups.
Right. That's a good point.
To give hope, to counteract the misinformation, the miseducation, is that we have to have an educated populace who can critically think ourselves through the problems that face us. That's the hope. And the hope is, as my mother said, take community classes, read, even in your own home, go on the internet, be discerning, and educate yourself on your U.S. Constitution, your state constitution, about government, about what's going on. That's where the change happens.
Now that's an uplifting comment. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else want to jump in? Yes, Louis.
I was thinking before we got on about the fact that last Friday was the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, the South Carolina case, Briggs versus Elliott, was the first one of the 5 that was decided under that name, Briggs versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And so I bring that up not just because it felt a little bit, I can't remember who said it. It felt like maybe the Supreme Court was gaslighting us, but like what a cruddy 70th anniversary present this is today. But I bring this up primarily because I think we just have to remind ourselves that Black South Carolinians and a minority of white South Carolinians who have seen the direction that history needs to head in, you know, Black South Carolinians have been front and center of making this state and this country into something more like a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been hard slogging every step of the way. And it hasn't just taken place through the formal political process or through the judicial system and office holding and voting. But even in that Briggs versus Elliott case, you know, the only way that those plaintiffs in Clarendon County could survive the experience of the court case was to band together, was to support each other. They faced economic repulse, was terrible. The point is that it was their solidarity, it was their organizing at the local level that made the Briggs versus Elliott case possible, right? It wasn't primarily the national level of the NAACP that did it. It came up from the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
If it were not for that local movement, the national NAACP would not have had anything to work with, right? And so I call that legacy to mind because our historical education is indispensable, and the right kind of historical education is indispensable. And I think we need to look to those kinds of examples for what the possibilities are now, right? That's why we study history, is not because of the past primarily. It's so that we have some good options about what to do next, right?
Right.
We can learn from experience. And I think I just echo what Marilyn said, that so much of what needs to happen in our state and in our country right now has very much to do with education. I think has very much to do with reorganizing a new kind of politics.
Mm-hmm.
The grassroots.
Well, we're so thankful that Louis was able to get most of what he had to say out. I think it's freezing a little bit, but everything that he had to say was certainly on point and uplifting.
Communities can participate and over. Sorry, yeah, thank you very
it's
much.
breaking up a little bit. So we're gonna go on and see if Lynn or Carmen have any closing remarks.
I'd just say, you know, I have an amateur interest in South Carolina history. I'm a 12th generation South Carolinian, which has led me to focus on a lot of good, bad, whatever. And I understand why our voters can be very cynical, and cynicism produces apathy. And we're absolutely, you know, this emphasis on we need to educate people. And a large part of that education has been, you know, needs to be, we understand why you feel cynical. We understand why you feel apathetic, but our future can be different if you leave that behind.
Mhm.
you know, if you are determined to make it change.
Right, yes, yes. And Carmen, have anything that you want to share with us?
So I just quickly looked up Fannie Lou Hamer's speech at the 1964 DNC convention, and it's not particularly uplifting, but there's a line in there where she questions whether this is America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where they try to stop people from voting. And I just think about, you know, United States trying to tell people around the world about the importance of democracy
Mhm.
when our whole political system right now is in the trash. We saw, for example, a clearly legitimately elected president blocked from appointing a Supreme Court justice. We saw another elected president, I left out a word on purpose, who was able, under those same circumstances, to appoint a president weeks before a re-election. And I just, you know, it just, for me, it's just trying to just make it make sense in my mind, because I grew up seeing people like Martin Luther King on television and hearing that message of hope and really internalizing that, and growing up and believing that if I was a person of excellence, that everything in the country would be open to me. And I found out that's not the case. But on the other hand, I think about my roots. Most of the people from whom I descend came over here in the belly of slave ships,
Right.
and they survived almost 400 years in this country. And what I think about on my worst days is that whatever they went through was certainly much more than what I went through. And the way for me to honor my ancestors is to continue that struggle. As Frederick Douglass says, power conceives nothing without demand. People may not get everything they pay for in this world, but they pay for everything they get. And I think we still need to demand, even if we don't get everything we're paying for, our demands are going to be the important thing to pushing this agenda forward. And that's all I
Right.
have to say.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank each one of you, Lynn Teague with the League of Women Voters of South Carolina, Marilyn Hemingway with the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce, Dan Carter, Emeritus, University of South Carolina, Carmen Harris, University of South Carolina, Upstate, and Louis Venters with the Francis Marion University. Again, you all got this call at the spur of the moment when we heard the decision today. So I want to thank you so much for making time to share with our audience here what you think and to provide your insights. Once again, thank you, Black Voters Matter, for the sponsorship. And we will be on the channel for people to watch and enjoy afterward and share. So thanks again. We will take your words of inspiration and hope and put them into the hopper so that we can keep doing the work.
Thank you, Catherine.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you all.
Thank you.